Okay.
All right. Cool. Welcome to Bike Maintenance 101, everyone. As Ben already put out a disclaimer, this is our first time doing this workshop and first time doing any sort of Zoom, anything 101. So please be patient, and it's not going to go perfectly. So just to start out, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an overview of some resources you can look at if, let's say, you forget everything from this workshop, or maybe you're still having trouble with your bike after trying some basic fixes. So if you're in the Pasadena area, there's some great bike shops around. Around the Cycle is one, Pasadena Cyclery, and InCycle. Those are the biggest three. There's also a ton of great resources on the Bike Lab website. So if you search Caltech Bike Lab in Google, you'll be able to find your way there. If you can't find it, maybe we can post the link in the chat at the end here. But they have great resources on where to ride in Pasadena, and also all sorts of great safety tips for how to ride safely, because cars on the roads are not always very friendly to bikes. Anything else you wanted to add there?
Maybe we could just take a moment to say like
Yeah, we should also probably introduce ourselves. So my name is Emily. I'm a second-year graduate student in mechanical and civil engineering, and I've always been into cycling. My dad got me into it. He's also a mechanical engineer, so going to a bike shop was never an option. And that's how I picked up a lot of the sort of things I know how to do with regards to fixing bikes. It's just a lot of trial and error.
I'm Ben, and I'm a fifth-year grad student in materials science. I've ridden bikes before, and I learned how to work on and build bikes in my first year of undergrad at University of Oregon. I've built several bikes since then, mostly road bikes, but rebuilt a couple of mountain bikes as well. And so, yeah, there's some experience, I guess, between the two of us on how to do at least the basics. Great.
All right, so I'm going to start by going through just a basic checklist of things that, let's say you have maybe a cruiser bike that you haven't really done any maintenance on in a while, something you're just riding around town but not super frequently. Just a short checklist of things you'll want to look at on your bike to make sure it's in working condition, things you'll want to check on from time to time before just hopping on there so you're safe on the road. So I'm going to switch to my phone right now and try to show you a few examples of things that I would check on my own bike. All right, can everyone hear and see from the iPhone now? Give me a nod. Yes, awesome. So I'm going to show you on my mountain bike, which you might notice is a little bit filthy, kind of things I would go through. So if I were just pulling this out of the storage closet and I hadn't just ridden it on some sand the other day, my first step would probably be just to wipe things down so I can actually see what's going on, check for any cracks in the frame, particularly if it's an older frame. Or if it's carbon. Sometimes they can actually crack down here in the bottom bracket. Next, very important step to check is the brakes. When I squeeze the lever, does it contact the wheel? If yes, continue checking. If no, hard stop, because you don't want to get on that thing and start cruising with your brakes not working. Another important thing to check, many bicycles will have quick release on the wheels here. And so that can maybe be loosened. Maybe your friend didn't really know what they were doing when they borrowed your bike. So that's something you'll want to check on as well. Make sure that the quick release on the wheels here is fastened. And I think Ben is going to show us a little bit more about that later. One other thing that's not absolutely essential just to get you from point A to point B is to roll through your shifters. So you're going to want to pedal with one hand, and then on the other hand, roll through, you might have index shifters. So just, do a shift. Does it actually move? Otherwise, you run the risk if you have maybe some old derailleurs or some cables that haven't been tightened in a long time when the bike sat in storage, you run the risk of getting stuck in a very uncomfortable gear if your shifters aren't actually working. And then last step before you hit the road, obviously make sure that your tires are pumped up to an appropriate pressure. And so there's a lot of debate about actually what is an appropriate pressure, but a good way to sort of find out, most tires will have some markings on them that will tell you what pressure they're rated for. Let's see. So here is the marking for what type of tire it is. You can see their Trail Boss. They have the dimensions on here. And then I believe on the other side, I should be able to see yes. I don't know if you can read it, but it says ride only at these tire pressure ratings. And it says 35 to 65 PSI. So a good rule of thumb, if you're not sure where in that range to go, if you're a heavier rider, go towards the upper end. If you prefer comfort over necessarily speed, go for a lower pressure, because the higher pressure, the more bumps you'll feel on the road. Anything you want to add, Ben?
I would just add, can everybody hear me or you can hear me? Okay. So I would just add to that in the case of mountain biking, as Emily said, sometimes people will deflate the tires a little bit in order to feel a little bit less of every single bump on the path. The other thing is, if you're on a road bike, I would pay special attention to the min and max tire pressure specifications. The reason being that if you overfill it, it's a little bit easier to basically blow the tube. And if you underfill, it's easier to get something like a pinch flat. That's really not super common, but there's not as much space in a road bike wheel. And so just be a little bit more cognizant of that when you use it.
So you'll probably also find that if you have skinny tires, they're going to lose their pressure a lot faster than if you have slightly thicker tires. So if you're on a road bike with really skinny ones, you're probably going to want to check that pressure fairly regularly. Whereas if you're on a mountain bike like this, I don't have to pump these tires up more than every week or two. All right.
I guess.
So step 2, I guess we can move on to showing you how to lubricate the chain. So you've gotten on your bike and maybe you've noticed that it's pretty noisy. Maybe your chain looks kind of dirty. It's got some grime on there, maybe even some rust. So lubing the chain is something you'll want to do fairly regularly to keep your bike in good working condition. And I will demonstrate how to do that. So I'm going to give the phone to Ben.
Thank you.
All right, so this tends to be a fairly messy process. Highly recommend putting a glove on one hand, particularly if your chain is really greasy or gross. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of cup the chain in the paper towel and just pedal. So I'm trying to wipe off any loose grit or stuff that might be stuck on there. If your chain hasn't been lubed in a long time, there may not be enough grease to actually sort of pull off the chain with that grit. And so what you can do is add some lubricant and then clean it after it's sat on there a little while, using the lubricant to help pull the dust and grime off. This is my mountain bike, so I can't say I'm a particular fanatic about keeping the chain clean, because it's just going to get dirty again next time I ride. The other thing you might consider doing if your bike is particularly dirty is going into the cassette here with a paper towel or a toothbrush and sort of digging it in between the different gears. So if you get a slightly thinner towel, yeah, you can just kind of tuck it in here and then get some of the grit out from in between. So if your bike's been sitting around for a long time or hasn't been cleaned in a while, that could be a useful step. And then the absolute sort of last resort, bike really needs a revamp. Just take a hose to it. If you've got dirt all over the place, I sometimes actually take my bike to one of the car washes and just hose it off after a long mountain bike ride. But I suspect for most of you, if you're just riding around town, just using a paper towel, maybe a wet rag should be sufficient. So once you've gotten as much grit off of the chain as you can, because we don't want to rub it back into the chain, you're going to grab some sort of chain lubricant. I highly recommend getting like a bike-specific chain lube. Don't just use WD-40 or something. WD-40 is a better solvent than it is a lubricant. So there's sort of options out there. There are some wax lubes or dry lubes. These kind of leave like a waxy film on the surface of your chain, but they dry super fast. They're not my favorite though, but you can absolutely try it. I prefer something more like this, considered just a typical like wet lube. So the idea with this is, first you open it up. I'm going to place a little drop of lubricant over each one of these chain connections. You can kind of go pretty fast. Just cycle through here. Do the same, and I'm holding a paper towel underneath. If you're doing this in your home especially, you will probably get grease on the floor if you're not careful, so I highly recommend putting some newspaper down or some paper towels. right, I think I've almost gotten all the way around. Yep. You can kind of tell by how shiny it is. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pedal and just try to distribute that, both across the chain and also across the cogs. So what you're going to want to do is go in here and shift through all the gears. So first in the rear, shifting through all of them. Pedal for a second on each one. So part of the purpose of the lube is not just to make your bike nice and quiet, it's also to protect the gears and the chain from getting a ton of dust on them, because dust, if it sits on there, if you've ever had a car that got really dirty or something, you'll know it can actually start to scratch the paint, degrade the metal over the time. So we go to the front gears as well. So now, depending on the type of lube, you might need to let it sit for a little while to fully soak in. Particularly like silicone-based lubes, you can just read the bottle. It'll have a recommended amount of time. You should let it sit on there. I'm going to go ahead and show you the next step. This type I would usually let it sit for about 10 minutes. But then you want to take a clean paper towel and just wipe off any excess. So you see people who get like chain grease on the inside of their calf here. That's either because they're putting their foot down right next to the chain, or because they just have way too much grease on there as well. So what I like to do is, again, just cup the chain and just pedal through here. So you're wiping off any excess that might otherwise drip, get on your leg, clog things up. And you can see, because my bike was dirty to begin with, I'm actually pulling some dirt off with it as well. All right, so let me show you. I don't know if you could hear my bike to begin with, but let's see if it's much quieter now. Oh yeah. There's no dirt or grime rubbing in there anymore. It's much quieter. And so even if your bike looks clean, a good way to tell that it's time to grease the chain is if it's really noisy. Whenever you're pedaling, and you've ruled out the fact that something else on the bike isn't rubbing. I recommend doing it probably about once a month or so if you're riding pretty regularly, but it's totally up to your preference.
Great. Okay, so I know we have at least one question from the chat, so we can hand you this. I'm going to turn the volume back on this. Okay, so we have at least one question in the chat, and that question is, how do you know when your chain needs cleaning and lubricating? One indication is something that Emily just mentioned, which is that when you're riding, you'll notice it's making a lot more noise than you're used to hearing. The noise or lack thereof that you could hear just now after Emily cleaned the chain is pretty typical noise for a bike that is being pedaled with the gears. And so when it's clean. So if it's dirty, you'll hear something different than that. What other tips would you have for when to do that?
Another good rule. So I went to my undergrad in the Northeast, and I left my bike outside all the time there. And so you can imagine that exposing it to the elements is going to put a lot more, I guess, sort of weathering that could occur to the chain. And again, the lube is there in part to protect the chain. So if you're storing it outside, particularly in an environment that's maybe a bit harsher than Southern California, I would definitely recommend lubricating the chain more often, or else it will rust. Let's see, we have another question in the chat here. Is there a way to do this without a bike rack? Yes, absolutely. So I don't have a bike rack at home. What I do is I take the bike, flip it over so it's balancing on the handlebars and the seat. And then, things will be upside down from how you were before, but then you can still spin the rear wheel freely. It's a little bit less convenient than having a bike stand, but works perfectly fine. And then what kind of cloth am I using? Yeah, so we have these really nice paper towels here. These are like garage paper towels. You can get them at an automotive store or Walmart. They're super great for this, or Costco. But you can also just use I wouldn't say, get like the next to cheapest paper towel from the grocery store. If you get the cheapest one, it'll just totally disintegrate on your chain. But anything slightly thicker than that, as long as you're not squeezing too hard and you just take your time with it, should be all right. One more question. All right. I think that answers the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I think so. One other thing, as an alternative, if you have some old cloths or rags or old t-shirts that you were planning to throw away, you can cut those up and turn those into rags, and you can use them for the same purpose as this. But I would caution you to wash those separately from your clothes because you don't want to get a bunch of grease and dirt and grime on your nice starched white t-shirt. So starched t-shirt. I don't think anybody's worn one this century, but anyway, be careful. Okay. Okay, so any other questions before we move on to the next segment?
Oh yeah, sorry. If you have like gears at like the back of the bike and like near the pedals, do you need to switch through the ones in the front and the back, or just the ones in the back after you lube it?
Go through both of them. So I went through the rear. You could probably see me shifting with my right hand. And then I also, oh, I'm getting a little nauseous with the other camera here. I also went through the gears on my left hand as well. And it doesn't really matter what gear you leave one in when you do the other. Just try to leave it in the middle is usually my rule of thumb, because otherwise the derailleur can rub a little bit if you're like all the way to one side in the rear and all the way to the big ring in the front. But yes, go through both sets.
Thanks.
All right. So I think next Ben is going to show you how you would go about adjusting your brakes. So that's maybe the next thing that you might notice having some trouble with on your bike. I want to start, I'm just going to show you real quick what the brakes look like on my bike. They're called disc brakes, and they're a little bit different. So if you have some that look like this and you want to ask me about it at the end, feel free. All right, so disc brakes, instead of having something that clamps just above the wheel here, I have these handy dandy discs down here where the braking mechanism actually sits. So this is really common on mountain bikes. It's also becoming more mainstream. So if you have a newer road bike, have something that looks like this. But I'm guessing for the most part, people will have friction brakes, which is what Ben has, and he's going to show you that.
Okay. Can everybody see this red bike? Okay, great. So this is my bike. This is a road bike that I've built up from a frame that I bought, and I have some, I'm just going to introduce you to it really quickly. I have some tires that are road width tires, but you can see they have a bit more tread than what you'd normally see on a road bike. That's pretty helpful if you're used to riding on, you know, really mild dirt paths. I wouldn't go on anything too intense. Or if you like to ride in, you know, on wet roads or something like that, or if you happen to do that. I don't know if anybody likes to, but sometimes it happens. Okay, so 1 second, let me check this list over here. Okay, so my brakes are rim brakes, and I'm gonna show you using the front wheel. This is the front wheel. These are the brakes here. This is a side pull mechanism, so it's pulling the brakes from the side of it, and the calipers, you can see, are drawn together, and then the pads make contact with the rim. There are other kinds of brakes, commonly called U-brakes. Those are common on old mountain bikes before disc brakes. They sometimes are called V-brakes. There are center pulls where instead of the pulling mechanism being here on the side, it's in the middle, and it either pulls in from the side or there's a cable that moves upward, and that contracts the calipers together. Okay, in the case of these side pull brakes, there's a little nub right here. This is the quick release lever. And if I want to increase the distance between this brake pad and this brake rim, or this wheel rim, what I do is just flip open this quick release lever. And then you can see there's, well, maybe you can't see, maybe I can try to show you more directly. Can you see here? So as I open this, that increases the distance there. Wow, that was a nice word. Okay. Oh, great, thanks. So what I'd use this for is working on the brakes. Certainly I would use it for that. I'm gonna need it in order to remove the front wheel from the frame. If these brakes are still engaged or the quick release is engaged, then I won't have enough space to pull the wheel out unless I deflate the tire, and I usually don't want to do that. And then to put this back in place, I just do the reverse. I just grab this piece, twist it back in, and then the brake is back in place. I'm going to open it for now because I'm going to show you something with quick release in a minute on the wheels for that too. I mentioned, thanks for pointing this out, I mentioned that there are V or U brakes commonly on some bikes. This bike here, actually, this bike is kind of a cruiser style bike that is in the bike lab. And these are the brakes that I'm talking about here. So you can see there's a caliper mounted on each side of the fork right here with an arm from each caliper piece. And then the quick release mechanism is actually right in here on this one. So the way that this brake works is when I pull, oh, yes, please, thank you. When I pull on the brake lever here, you can see it applies tension across between these 2 points, pulls them together and applies the brakes down here. If I want to quick release this, I can move our little rubber protector out of the way. And can you see beneath here? This reflector is kind of in the way. Use reflectors and lights if you can. I'll show you those on my bike too. And then what I want to do is basically make sure I've got my hand either here on the cable or out here on the housing, so I can apply force to it and then push these two calipers together. And then you can see this little piece is going to move out of its position. I don't have a better way to describe that. And then once I drop this little arm, now it's in quick release. It's been quick released. So these are pretty common brake styles. If you just kind of ride an old mountain bike around town, you very likely have something like this. Thank you. Okay, so I mentioned a second ago that I want to use the quick release if I want to remove my wheels. This is the quick release lever for the wheel. We'll go through that in a little bit too when I show you how to change it too. I'm going to make a quick diversion because I want to pitch safety for a second. And I want to do that by talking about lights. So here's a front light mounted to my bike. Usually a front light has some kind of a mount. This one's a little bit intense because I wanted to make sure that I could have plenty of light if I went on a long ride. So the mount for the bike onto the handles is actually quite a bit of heavy plastic and a screw. Some cheaper lights just have an elastic band. Either way though, you want to have some kind of front light that is going to make traffic aware of your presence. And the same is true of a backlight. Again, this is more intense than what most mounts will look like, but you can certainly get these, or you can get the ones that just attach with a piece of elastic. And then you want certainly your bike to be visible to cars and other cyclists and pedestrians behind you. I would argue that if you had to pick one, I would pick the backlight. But if you can avoid that compromise, then avoid it. Okay, so back to brakes. What's that? Oh, thanks. So on brakes, typically, there is a barrel adjuster as well. In the case of my brake setup, there is one barrel adjuster. Sometimes there are two barrel adjusters. If there are two, there's usually one near the brake lever or where the housing for the brake exits from the brake lever. I have weird handlebars, so you can't see it here. Since mine don't have that, I only have a barrel adjuster right here where the housing and the cable meet the brake caliper. What you can do with this essentially is increase or decrease the compression of this housing. And this housing is what carries the cable from the brake lever here down to the brakes here. As I move this barrel adjuster, you might be able to see it. You can see the threadings moving, and then there's an increase in the spacing here above the caliper. As I do this, what I'm doing is twisting it to the left, basically loosening it. That increases the tension on the cable, which brings these pads closer to the rim. And then as I do the reverse, I get the reverse, and I increase the spacing between these pads and the rim. This is common to use as a simple maintenance trick if you need to fix the spacing between your brakes and rim. And it can be used as a trick for installation, but we won't really get into installing brakes today.
So then, let's say I tightened it all the way, and my brakes are still too loose for my taste. What do I do next?
If you tightened it all the way.
Yeah, so I have no more adjustment left in the barrel. How can I then make my brakes tighter still?
Thank you.
Emily knows I don't have my list in front of me, so this is very helpful. So in order to accomplish tightening your brakes, if you're out of room on your barrel adjuster here, you want to go to the cable, the brake cable, which is right here. Maybe I can go from a different side and you can see this. This is your brake cable. Well, this is my brake cable. You have one too, though. In order to adjust the tension on this cable, there's a screw or a bolt right here on my bike, and this takes an Allen key. I think it's a size 4 or 5. And basically what I would do is I would loosen this, and then I would pull on this either with my hands, which is a bit of a pain but can be done, or with a special tool called a third hand tool. And you can increase the tension on your brakes here. If you don't have the availability to do that or don't feel comfortable, you should at least know that that's how that works.
And then last thing is about the contact of the brake pads.
Oh, right, the contact of the brake pads. Thank you. So these brake pads here, as I mentioned, are essentially, well, every piece of the brake is important, but these are the things that do the braking because they're what stops this rim from spinning anymore, like this. So normally when people haven't built bikes before, they assume that when you mount a brake pad to a caliper arm, you want for the brake pad and the rim to be perfectly even with each other. In reality, though, we actually want to have a little bit of an angle. I'm going to show with my hand, a little bit of an angle, kind of like this. This is exaggerated, where the front end of the brake pad toes into the rim closer than the rear end of the brake pad does. The reason for that is, well, there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that if the brake is perfectly even with the rim, then as you apply the brakes, you'll hear a lot of really nasty noises and squeaking. And you'll only really have one level of braking power to apply. If you angle in the pad here, you'll eliminate any bad noises you might hear, and you'll give yourself kind of a gradient of braking power that you can apply as these arms flex and the pad makes more and more contact as you pull in on your brake lever here. Okay. Yeah, let's do it. Good.
All right.
Oops.
Can you hear us on the main screen again? Yes?
Can you hear us?
Okay.
Okay.
So one good question that was posted in the chat. Where is the recording going to be posted? At Greg.
It'll be on the Caltech Y website. There's a section I think called News, and it'll have videos at the bottom of that. Give us a few days and it'll be up there.
All right. So then I guess before we move on, does anyone have any questions about how to adjust your brakes? Maybe your brakes look a little bit different and you want an explanation. Maybe we didn't clarify something well. What questions do you guys have? Nothing. All right. You did a perfect job. Great. Okay, so next we're going to move on to talking a little bit about the shifters. Now, these are, I want to say, a lot more finicky than the brakes in many cases. So your bike most likely has what are called index shifters, unless it's a really old bike. So the idea there is that one click equals one change in the gear. And what that means is that there's a lot of room for things to go wrong as well. So I'm going to try to show you a few spots where you might check on it and try to make some adjustments yourself. Obviously, if things are going wrong, the derailleurs are one of the more complex and expensive components on a bike. So if you feel really lost, take it to your local bike shop. They will know what to do. They will help you out. But there are some relatively simple adjustments you can make on your own. So I want to show you those on my bike. How do I turn the sound off on here? All right. So on my bike, I have index shifters. As I mentioned, one click equals one gear change. One thing to note is that whenever you're changing gears on the bike, you need to be pedaling. If you're not pedaling, if I just click it and I'm not moving the pedal, nothing happened. Why is that? Because it has nowhere to actually move the chain until there's some tension applied to the chain itself. All right, so let's say your shifters are making a lot of noise. The first thing to check in that case would be something called the front derailleur. So that's this guy right here. You'll notice that the chain sits inside of this little guy. And so when I pull on the cable, it's going to pull the front derailleur either to the right or to the left, which is then going to push the chain in that direction as well. However, it is fairly common for this guy to get a little bit out of adjustment. And so you can see in here, my chain's actually really close to rubbing the inside of that front derailleur, which could then lead to some unpleasant noises. So the first thing to check is, am I in an appropriate gear? So for example, maybe you can hold this. Thank you. So for example, if I was in the smallest gear in the back, it's making noise.
So you'll notice smallest gear in the back is
easiest gear in the back.
Easiest gear in the back. It's the largest ring, and there's an inverse relationship between the size of the ring in the back and the difficulty. So
Yeah,
sorry, I just wanted to clarify
yeah,
that.
thank you for clarifying that then. Basically, if I had it here, and let's say I moved the front derailleur all the way out to this big ring. Let's just sit here and do that. There's a pretty steep angle here. So the chain is being pulled from here all the way out to the right, as likely that it's going to be rubbing on the inside of this front derailleur. That's pretty normal, and it's unavoidable on most bikes that you're going to have a little bit of that when you're in this extreme of the gear ratio. But if it's rubbing, let's say you're closer to the middle here, something more reasonable. If you notice it rubbing, then you probably want to make some adjustments. So let me show you the first thing you can do. Assuming that everything is shifting pretty well, you're not having any trouble getting between the gears, something you might want to look at are the limit screws. So these limit screws are usually located right next to the front derailleur, or in the case of the rear derailleur, let me see where these are located on this guy. They're a little bit harder to find. They're kind of around the back here. And those set the limit of how far out and in the derailleur can be moved. So on some cases they'll be labeled. On my bike they're not, but I can tell you that this screw sets the limit for how far inside it can go, and this screw sets the limit for how far outside it can go. Now, I personally always have a little trouble remembering which way to turn it, but basically, if you're feeling resistance, then you're broadening how far away it can go. So let's say, for example, that it's always rubbing, or for example, if you are biking and it wants to actually throw the chain off to one side, you're going to want to narrow that limit by adjusting this limit screw. And I think you'll find that a little bit goes a long way. So make a small adjustment, make sure you're doing it in the correct direction before you, accidentally pull the whole thing out. Same goes in the rear. Usually the rear is a little bit less prone to having issues, but if it's been a long time since you've ridden the bike and everything's all out of whack, maybe you threw it off a cliff a few times, you might need to make some adjustments on the rear derailleur as well. As I mentioned, the limit screws for this case, I'm trying to get it so you can actually see my finger. There it is. Okay, the limit screws in this case are right here. So we have out and in on my bike. Your bike might be slightly different. If you're not sure, one thing I always do, since I have a few different bikes with all different components, I look at, okay, what is this derailleur called? Shimano Diore. Perfect. Google it, pull up. Just if you're really nervous and you don't want to touch the wrong screw, that's one way to just figure it out. But it's a really easy adjustment you can make at home on your own. The next thing that you might need to adjust with your derailleurs is the tension in them. So similarly to how the brakes have some adjustment where you can actually make them work more tightly or more smoothly, let's say you're pedaling along, you're clicking the brake or the shifting lever, and nothing is happening. So that probably means that you either have too much or too little tension. And so it's actually not pulling the chain far enough. That would be too little tension. Too much tension would be if you click it and it skips a gear and it goes 2 over. That means you have too much tension in the derailleur cable. You can make that adjustment very similarly. So some bikes will have 2 barrel adjusters. My bike does not have one actually at the derailleur. So you'll want to come up here And similarly to how there was a barrel adjuster on the brakes on Ben's bike, we have one up here. And it works the same way as well. So if I, let's see, if I turn it one way, I'm compressing the housing, it'll make the cable itself looser. Yes? Compress the housing, cable looser.
If you compress the housing,
Cable tighter.
so
Thank you.
if you loosen it, basically if you see more threads
Mhm.
on the, like if you see more threads, basically if you're creating more space in there, then it makes it tighter.
There we go. Thank you, Ben. I always mess this up as well. So if you're like me and you're a little bit dyslexic when it comes to righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, you can just turn it one way, see what happens, turn it back if you need to. That's usually my modus operandi. And then one other thing Ben mentioned, I also have these barrel adjusters at the brake levers. So if you have this as well and you're trying to adjust the shifters, take a look, make sure you pick the correct one. It would really suck if I'm trying to loosen my derailleur cables and I get out there and it turns out I actually have no brakes. So just be careful about that before making any of these adjustments. If things are really out of whack, let's say you've just replaced the cables on your whole bike because you're one of those crazy people, you're gonna need to actually come in here and set the tension at the bolt. So much like, let me come around to the other side here. I'm showing the front derailleur because it's something I just adjusted recently because I put a new cable on here. But let's say that you're out of adjustment space on the barrel adjusters again. What you'll need to do in that case is unscrew it at the bolt right here. I think this is also number 4 or 5. And then you'll want to pull the tension, or pull the cable through here to set the tension. So a good way to sort of set up the bike is try with the barrel adjusters. If it's not good enough, go ahead and adjust the cable itself. You might want like a second pair of hands on here because as soon as I loosen this, the cable's going to want to go flying through here. And then go back to the barrel adjusters when you're done to make some fine adjustments. Oh, I can take care of that. Let me see if I have anything else on my list that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, so if you're still having trouble with your shifters after trying these things, let's say you're clicking the index shifter and just nothing is happening. Inside this black thing right here, the shifter housing, there's a lot of stuff going on, particularly with index shifters. These guys are made out of plastic and they don't last forever. So if you're still having a lot of trouble, chances are there's some sort of part in here that's gone bad. Maybe your cables have a kink in them somewhere. So particularly if you like leave your bike outside a lot, the cables can get a little bit of a kink if somebody bumps into it. And you probably just want to take it to your local bike shop at that point, explain to them what the issue is, and probably within a day or two, or in COVID times, a week or two, they should have it fixed up for you.
I'm going to take Let's actually go to this table here, or something like that. Can everybody still hear? Great. So I mentioned before I use this shorthand term called a third hand tool. That's this tool here that you should be able to see. Can you see that? Yep, this one here. So it's also called a cable puller. If you go to buy it somewhere and you call it a third hand tool, they might look at you kind of funny. It's a cable puller. And the way that this works, Emily mentioned you might have an issue where if you loosen like this, if I loosen this bolt here, this cable is going to try to run away from me by escaping the derailleur. To avoid that, what I do is I use this mechanism here to decrease the space in between this arm and this little stop. You can see that pinches. And then the idea is I'm going to grab the cable in here, and then I'm going to use this to maintain spacing. And I'll show you that here. So maybe I can do it like this. So if I do this, I grab the cable here, and then I push against that there. And now you can see if I loosen, as long as I hold my hand in place, my left hand, if I loosen this bolt, I'm not going to lose the cable. I wouldn't expect that most people would have something like a cable puller, but if you find yourself inspired by this and you want to start doing a little bit more of kind of the basics of working on your brakes, these things aren't too expensive. If you ever want to check it out, I recommend it. It makes stuff like adjusting the cable itself much, much easier.
Thanks, Ben. That's a tip I did not know about. I just use needle nose pliers and say a few cuss words whenever I'm adjusting mine at home. So that's great to know. All right, let's go back to the computer.
I keep hitting escape when I also take us off of mute. Okay.
What questions do you guys have about adjusting the shifters or anything like that on your bike?
On my bike oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
On my bike personally, I noticed that like the gear near the pedals, it tends to just fall off to the left side. Like it goes like, if I'm going from like 3 to 2, it tends to just jump off 2 and just fall off. So I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. So you remember I was talking about the limit screws, which set how far the derailleur can actually go to one side. So if your limit is set such that the derailleur is really far to the inside, then when you do try to shift down, there's space for the chain to just get completely thrown off to the inside there. So there's 2 ways to avoid this. The fix on your bike is to decrease that limit such that it doesn't have as much space. So you would want to basically pull the derailleur further away from the bike on its inner limit there. The other sort of good practice to get into is whenever you're shifting down to the smallest gear in the front, so the easiest to pedal in the front, make sure you're not also in the biggest gear or the easiest to pedal in the back. Because if you do that, there's less of a chain angle and it's going to be a lot easier to throw it. So in that case, having a little bit of an angle on the chain, let's say you're in the middle in the rear and you're trying to go to the smallest one in the front, can actually help you because the chain is going to be less likely to fall all the way off on the inside. Does that help you out, Albert?
Yeah, it does. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Any other questions about adjusting your derailleurs or your shifters? All right.
Great.
The moment, the time that I think most people have all been waiting for.
Oh yeah, switching out your tire tube. Let's see. Do you mind if we pull this one more time? Okay, so quick release mechanics. Right. Okay, great. So now we're going to deal with something that I don't know. I don't know a single cyclist that ever enjoys having a flat tire on the road. But I also don't know a single cyclist that hasn't had it happen. So we should go through quickly how to replace the tube. What I will say, actually, I have a note to do this in a minute, but I'm just going to start with it here. And if I remember in a second, I'll do it too. If you want to get into using a patch kit, you can do that. But what I would do first is make sure that while you're at home, you've tested that patch kit in order to reliably repair a tube that you know has a hole in it. The reason I say that is because there are different kinds of patch kits. Some of them actually use something like a glue. Some of them use more like a vulcanizing rubber. Eventually, it kind of becomes its own part of the tube. So if you're more comfortable with using that at home, you know how long to let things set up before you put them back in the wheel. You're going to be a lot better off if you have to use it on the road. You can be successful with a patch kit, but that's my preface to that. What I do with my bike, and actually maybe we can switch the audio now, and I'll show it here. Can you all hear me on the phone? Great. So with my bike, what I do is I have this little saddle bag right here. I have this because I don't always want to carry a bigger bag with me or something like that. You can also have a couple of tools in your backpack, and it doesn't need to be much. What I normally do, these usually just open out like this. I normally have one tube in here, and then you can see I've also got 2 tire levers packed away in here. I haven't had to use this tube yet since I built this bike. So this isn't something that you're going to have happen all the time. Don't let seeing something like this deter you from getting into cycling because you feel like you have to buy a bunch of stuff. Just be aware that these things will help you if you're out on the road and something happens.
Yeah. Also note that if you do want to carry a tube with you, which is a great idea, you also need to carry a pump.
Right.
Otherwise, you will have no way to actually reinflate your tire. Yeah. So you don't have to like take a full-on bike pump and put it in your pocket. There are some mini ones. You can buy one on Amazon that takes CO2 cartridges. There are others that are hand pumps where you have to work a lot harder but they're compact enough to fit in your pocket, and some will even fit on the frame of the bike.
That's what this does here. This is a hand pump that mounts into an adapter strap that I have, so I carry that. Yeah.
So carry all 3 items or none of them.
If you're around town, if you're just cycling around Pasadena, the chances that you're going to find yourself in a position where this is the only thing that can save your day are pretty slim. Like Emily mentioned before, there are a few bike shops around. And so if you get a flat while you're in town, chances are you can walk to a bike shop within 15, 20 minutes. I would make use of that, honestly, if you're just around here. But you should be aware of these other things that you can think about. Okay, so on our way to the front wheel, I want to just show you two differences between my bike and Emily's bike that you can think about. This one is not so much difference, just as kind of a reinforcement. This is my rear derailleur here. These are the 2 limit screws, kind of like what Emily was talking about. One limit screw, other limit screw. This screw here is intended to help mount the derailleur, so don't worry about this one. These are limit screws. And then the same exists on the front derailleur, just on this side here. You can see 2 limit screws here. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because derailleurs come in all shapes and sizes, and you should know generally that all those basic components are there. The other thing is my shifters are a different style. They're pretty rare. Usually you'll run into an index shifter like what Emily was showing you, but sometimes on old bikes, you might see a friction shifter. A friction shifter is designed so that you don't click once and you're in a new gear. You click a certain number of times. Like in mine, it's usually 3, and then I shift. And then I can go back down and shift. So the idea with a friction shifter is that you kind of have to know what the distance is that you need to move the lever. Okay, so anyway, if I want to, let's say something happens to my front tire, if I want to take this off of the frame, what I do, as I mentioned before, disconnect the quick release on the brakes, and then disconnect the quick release on the wheel. Quick releases are really common these days. It's less and less common to find a bike without them, but there are some with bolt-on hubs or bolt-on skewers. This old bike we showed you before has them. So there's a bolt here, or a nut here, and a nut here, and these each thread onto this axle bolt. Usually that's most things in bikes are metric. Usually that's a 15 millimeter bolt size. And if you have a bike like that and you need to remove it, you just have a wrench, usually an adjustable wrench, and you pull that off and do the same thing we're about to do. Okay, so I'm gonna open this lever, move it away from the frame, and now I can pull the wheel out. This is my front wheel. Okay, so since I don't have anything wrong with my tube, we're gonna make it so that it is as if I did. And this is gonna be my opportunity too to talk to you about different kinds of valves. This is a Presta type valve here. This is common on road bikes. And it's basically this thinner stem. And then there's this little nut that you can see me moving around and tightening and loosening here. If I want to make any adjustments to the tire pressure, I have to make sure that this nut is not tightened against the stem like it is. So I loosen it like that. And then as I press in here, you'll hear a loud noise, and that's the air releasing. This takes just a second because I want to make sure it's nice and flat for you. In a second, we can show you what the other type of valve is. It's really common on older bikes and on mountain bikes.
Yep, I actually have Presta valves on my bike, so I can't show you that example, but it's the exact same. It's called a Schrader valve. It's the exact same thing as you'll see on a car tire. So if I unscrew this cap right here, you'll see there's nothing to actually unscrew from here, but there's a little pin in the top of the valve here. And so when you put your bike pump on it, it's going to push on the pin, and that accomplishes the same thing as pushing on the Presta valve on the one that Ben showed you. So just one thing to note is that you'll need a different type of bike pump head for either one of these. A lot of bike pumps, I think most of them at this point, will have both on there. So either side by side or one on one side, one on the other. And I'll show you when it becomes time to pump Ben's tire back up.
Right. So how are we doing? Is everybody?
Yeah.
Does anybody have to take off or anything?
Yeah, I think some people are leaving, but we'll post the recording.
Sure. Okay, so I've got these two tire levers here. you can actually do a lot of this with one tire lever, but I have found that life becomes easier if you use two. So maybe we can, or I can use a bench, I guess. But
Do you want to sit?
yeah, let's sit for a bit. I'll actually do this. So if I need to move my tire, I use my tire lever, and then you can see as I pull aside the tire, here's the tire. This shiny little piece right in here is the bead of the tire. There's wire in there. This yellow piece is tape applied to the inside of the rim to keep the tube safe from the sharp edges of the rim, and then this is the rim. So I'm going to insert my tire lever between the tire bead and the rim, and I'm going to try to use this lip to catch the inside of the bead. As I mentioned before, I haven't really had many issues with this tire getting flat tubes before. So the bead of this is likely to be very tight. That changes over time the more that you remove and replace the tire. So I've got one in here right now, and you can see I can pull it to the outside of the rim. My life's going to get a lot easier if I get a second one in here, because that's going to allow me to actually make sure I'm not losing ground as I take off my tire. So I'm going to have, what's that? So now that I have the tire, let me make sure I get a good spot for this. On the outside of the rim, I can actually just run my tire lever all the way around the rim, like this. And now it doesn't look like a functional wheel anymore, which is good.
One other thing to note with the tire levers is that a lot of them have some sort of a notch in them. So if you're really struggling with it and you feel like you need both hands, you get your first tire lever in here, and then this notch is to help you out. You can put it over one of the spokes. It's not great for your spokes, but that way you don't have to keep a hand on this first tire lever while you're working with the second one.
Great. And that's actually something that I didn't know. I've never used that little notch, so thanks for the tip. Okay, so now we're in a position where we can remove the tube. If you have a really narrow tire, you don't have a lot of space to work with, you might find yourself wanting to take the tire off completely, but we're going to save ourselves the work of doing that. So the next thing I want to look at is right here. This is back to our Presta valve. There's a little screw right here that I'm loosening. This screw is designed to help give me control over what's going on with the Presta valve. And there's a reason for that, because if I say I'm applying a pump to this or mounting a pump onto this, if I don't have control of what's going on with the Presta valve, I can cause issues with where the valve connects to the tube, and I'll show you that in a second. So I'm going to remove this, because if I don't do that, then I can't get the tube out of here. And now that that's off, what I can do is, some people have class.
We have some folks heading to class, but we'll post the recording.
Yeah. So
I usually recommend,
maybe starting on the
yeah,
side.
starting either 90 degrees or 180 degrees from the valve stem,
Right.
and just pulling the rubber out.
Pull the tube just like this.
If you try to start at the valve, you won't be able to get anywhere.
You'll have a bad time. So now I've pulled the tube out of the tire, out of the wheel, and then you can see that the only thing left is to remove it from the valve area. So now I can just kind of pull can you see where my hand is going in? So now I can just kind of pull this back, and then you can see I can remove it completely. So this area right here, you can see where this valve stem meets the tube. This area is pretty well reinforced. You can see it. You might be able to see there's a little bit more rubber in that area. But the reason you want to make sure you can control what's going on with the valve if you apply a pump or something is that you can create little tears in this area. And if you do that too many times, you'll end up with a flat by that way. So that's no fun. Okay, so that's how we pull the tube out of the tire. If we want to put the tube back in the tire, we're going to make our lives a lot easier if we have a little bit of air inside the tube. So pretend this is a new tube. And can I use this pump here? Okay. So we're going to cross our fingers that this pump applies to Presta valves. I'm sure it does.
There's a few pumps around. We can also use the air compressor if you'd rather.
Okay, so this is actually one of the pumps that Emily was talking about. This top attachment goes to a Schrader valve, and this bottom one goes to a Presta valve, this small one. So I'm going to basically mount that onto my valve like this and pull the lever out. Some different kinds of pumps actually have a reverse lever action. I've only seen one, and it's from Germany, but it's the kind of pump I have at home, so I figured I'd mention it. Some of them start with the lever out, and then you press the lever in to engage it. And then you can see I'm just pumping up now, and now I've got some air in this tube.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally enough. What I just put in there is generally enough to get this job done. Because I don't want to put in a full tube. That's going to make life even harder. I want something with just a little bit of air because I want to have some kind of form to it as I put it back into place. So this one I normally actually do tend to start with.
Yeah. Now one thing to mention is if you're actually changing a flat at home, you're not going to want to go and just immediately put a tube back in. It's always good to diagnose the source of a flat. So Ben didn't have a flat, so it didn't even occur to him.
Yeah.
But here are a few things to check.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder on that. So one thing as Emily said, if you got a flat for a reason, and you should know what that reason is. One of the most common reasons is some kind of sharp object poking in through the tire and into the tube. If you're cautious, you can take your fingers and gently kind of inspect the inside of this tire for something poking through. I've done that and been successful. I've done that also and been successful, but caused my fingertips to bleed with like a goat head or something. So there are some other ways to do that. I think Emily, you might know. Is there one that you've tried? Or
no, I always use my fingers. You can, yeah, just be careful. As soon as you find something, don't continue running your fingers. And then when you're trying to pull it out, use tweezers or something. Using your fingernails is a surefire way to just make yourself bleed more.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing you could do, as in any of these cases, you could put on like a nitrile glove or something. Mm-hmm. That'll give you just a little bit of a barrier. You'll feel the abnormality or the asperity on the surface of your tire, and you may not poke yourself.
Yeah, but
it's nothing to be scared of, but just be aware.
Yeah. So if you find a thorn or something or a rock, make sure you pull it out. Because if you leave it in there and you put a new tube in, guess what? You're going to get the same flat in the same place.
Right. Some thorns and things cause enough damage to a tire that you'll need to replace the tire. I've actually never had that happen. I've been able to pull a thorn out and put a new tube in, and the tire's been fine. Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say that I searched my tire and I didn't feel anything pokey. So what's going on?
If you didn't feel anything pokey, then the first couple things I would check is make sure that this valve stem connection to the tube is still intact. Make sure there aren't any holes in here. And then I would also kind of check the tube and see if there's anything that looks like a little bit of a slice or an incision in the tube. Usually that indicates a pinch flat. Mm-hmm. And a pinch flat is when the tube gets trapped between this outside of the wire bead on the tire, and the inside of the rim. The tube should be inside the tire, but sometimes it can be trapped between the tire and the rim, and that will almost always cause a pinch flat. Mm-hmm. And that just comes down to mounting the tube correctly and making sure that you have enough pressure in the tube so that it can't work its way out of place.
This can also happen if you have skinny tires and you have them underinflated. The tube can actually wrap around on itself just enough to create a pinch flat, and what that will look like is it's like snake bites. You'll see two little incisions right next to each other. That indicates that you had a pinch flat from that instance as well. And if you're not sure, if you really can't find anything, a good trick is to put some air in the tube, just put it in as fast as you can before it all escapes, and hold it in a bucket of water. So you'll see some bubbles coming up from wherever the hole in the tube is, and that should help you trace it back to the location either on the tire or to finding out that it's a pinch flat.
I accidentally I didn't inflate this enough, so I'm just gonna pump a little bit more air into this. That's pretty good.
All right, so once you've diagnosed the source of the flat and removed it, you'll want to reinflate.
Yeah, so now we're gonna kind of reverse the process from before. So when I remount this, this is a little more air than I normally use, but that's okay. Or I hope it is. So I usually start by inserting the stem into the rim first, and I am going to let a little bit of air out here. Okay. When letting air out of a tube for this, a little bit goes a long way. So, so I reinsert the stem, and here's where this is going to be awkward because I haven't done it much on this tire. There's not a lot of extra room in here. It's a road style tire. So basically the idea is I want to get the tire bead over the tube now, and then I'm going to work my way around the tire. And you can do this in a couple different ways. The way I'm doing it is the wrong way. That's not actually the wrong way. It's a way that it can lead to having some difficulties when you go to remount the tire. And the reason for that is, as I push this tube into the tire, if I go one way, I'm eventually going to find that I've applied tension to that in one direction. We might actually have just rotated the tube with respect to the wheel. If that happens, this valve stem will be pointed in one direction or the other, but not straight. So what I normally want to do is actually insert the tube symmetrically around the tire for the wheel. You'll notice that there's a little bit of extra noise as I do this because I'm interacting with this stool. The same will happen with whatever surface you're working on. Sometimes bikes are just a little bit noisy to work on. And now I've got pretty much the whole tube tucked up into the tire. One of the other benefits of having inflated this a little bit before I went ahead and mounted it inside the tire is that it's harder then to create any twisting of the tube. So you want to make sure that the tube is not twisted in there. Okay, so the tube is all inside the tire. The bike is still not rideable. And the reason for that is because now we have to mount the tire onto the rim. There are a couple ways to do this. If you use levers, as most people will need to do, what you want to do is make sure that, I'll just show you. So if I go to use a lever to mount this bead, again, instead of pulling it like I did before, I'm just going to reverse this. And instead of grabbing the bead, now I'm going to grab the rim. But you can see right in here, maybe you can see there's a tube right there. So when I do that, I have to be careful that I'm grabbing the rim and not grabbing the tube and the rim. That's another way you can give yourself a flat. So just be careful with that.
Yeah. So a good practice is to do as much of this with your hands as you can. So notice how Ben is pushing, he's got started and he's just pushing the tire back in. If you have wider tires, like on my bike, you will probably be able to do all of this by hand.
Great. Yeah, if you have wider tires, you can do it all by hand. If you have older tires, you can do it all by hand because this wire bead will be looser. And then you can see I just work my way around here. And then this is where we probably have the most tension on the bead, and it will be the most difficult to remount this tire. You can either try to keep doing this with your thumbs and give yourself sore thumbs for the rest of the day, which we won't do here because I'm not going to actually be able to get this back over the rim. And in this case, what I'm going to do is basically bring the lever back into play. So like Emily said, we started by making sure we weren't overusing the levers at the beginning. Now we're going to make sure that we're using them carefully, again, avoiding grabbing the tube to try to remount our tire. And this is always harder than I remember doing it last time.
Yeah.
Well, that's a flat. See, like I said, you have to be a little bit careful of this because you can give yourself a flat. I just did that here. Not a big deal, but something to be aware of. There are other techniques for doing this where you can start two in the same place and work your way around.
Yep. One last tip is if you're working with a new tire in particular and you're getting really stuck, just leave it there for like an hour. Because if you leave it there with that tension on the tire, the bead will actually loosen a little bit and you'll be able to get it back on the rim.
Right. And then now it's remounted. So we'll just pretend that was a time lapse where instead of flattening my tube, it just sat there for an hour. And now it's back in place. You can inflate it again, put it back in your bike, and you're good to go.
Yeah, one last tip. Let's say that you got it back on there with the tire livers and you're a little bit worried that you may have caught the tube somewhere. A good way to sort of pump it up without entirely blowing the tube off, because you can actually, blow up in your face, is to put a little bit of air in there and kind of take your hand and wiggle around the side. So you'll wiggle around, that'll reseat the bead. It'll also help make sure that the tube is inside the tire and not, up against between the tire and the wheel. Wait a little while, you might hear a pop or something, and as long as it's not a pop followed by a hiss, it usually means that you've actually just reseated the tube correctly rather than, blowing up your tube.
Right. Yeah, thanks for the reminder of that. Yeah, it's good. It's a good idea. Your tube will seat itself into place, and you'll hear it doing that.
Yep.
But it's not a violent.
Yeah. So once you've got it on there, you're pretty sure that you haven't caused yourself another flat, which it does happen, especially with skinny tires. Nothing to be ashamed of. Pump it up. You'll want to put it back on your bike, and then you should be all set to go. Just make sure, again, that you get the pressure right. Because if you underinflate it, chances are you might get another pinch flat if that was the original cause.
Okay.
All right.
I think we have a few.
Sorry. These aren't questions. These are people letting us know they are going. Okay. So does anybody have any questions about this last bit with the tire or about the rest of the process?
I guess just kind of some general questions I had is, I don't know if it's open during COVID, but is the bike lab accessible if we want to like borrow a bike for something or just use the equipment there?
Yeah, so at the moment, there were some bike share bikes that were available for use before COVID. Those are not available as far as I know right now. We're not actually officers of the bike lab or anything. So the best person to get in touch with is Lorenzo. He's amazing. He's also happy to, do a Zoom call. He's done a few sessions where he actually helps people sort of remotely fix their bikes. As far as I know, there are no new keys being offered to the bike lab, but when things go back to, non-COVID era practices, there are normally office hours where somebody who's knowledgeable about bike maintenance will just set up shop in here, and anyone who would like help fixing their bike can come by and get that help. For the tools that we were showing you and the things we were showing you today, all those tools are super cheap. You can get some plastic levers like this on Amazon for like $5. You can get an Allen key set. I have a little one. That has like all the different tools on it that I just keep in my pocket. And that's also a great investment and something that's helpful to carry with you as well. But that should be really the extent of everything you would need to do these maintenance things we showed you today.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I guess one other question. More pertinent, I guess, when the pandemic kind of calms down or from before the pandemic, but was there group rides that the bike lab organized or something like that?
Yeah, there were. So Lorenzo, I used to go on these. Lorenzo would put together usually a Saturday or Sunday morning ride. Depending on who showed up, we'd do something more or less chill. I may have dragged him on some less chill rides once in a while. And I'm hopeful that those will resume at some point as well. You might also check out the Triathlon Club. And an additional resource in the area that I personally love is the Pasadena Athletic Association. It's not Caltech affiliated, but it is a great organization that also does group rides. And currently they have virtual challenges going on. So you can join them. It's like $10 to join as a student, and you can definitely eat your money's worth.
Okay. What kind of loops did you guys have for group rides before?
Oh, what was that question? Oh, what routes? I kind of usually ride alone or with one other person. So getting to the Rose Bowl is good.
Yeah, so there are some great resources on the Bike Lab website if you just want to see what streets are actually bike friendly. Another thing is if you go to the Caltech Triathlon Club website, there's a new widget on there where one of our more intense cyclists, Soichi, has put several route suggestions up. Some of them are pretty intense and go through some of the forest roads that are currently closed, but there are some great options on there as well. So yeah, Rose Bowl is a really great one if you're just starting out. You can ride some laps there, get the feel of things. And the hills above the Rose Bowl also tend to be fairly bike friendly and a little bit more interesting. The other thing I can recommend is just go on Strava. If you've heard of it, it's an app that a lot of runners and cyclists use, and you can see local routes, local segments that people like to ride.
Cool.
All right, we had a question in the chat. At what point should a tire be replaced? That is an excellent question.
Yeah.
When you no longer have traction on the ground, you definitely need to replace your tire.
Yeah. Yeah, when you don't have traction anymore, when you don't have tread anymore. As I mentioned before, when I built this bike, I wanted to be able to take it on some irregular surfaces, or maybe some that have a little bit of small gravel or silt or something. So I got these tires that you saw before that have some tread on them like this. And if I saw this tread diminish to the point where it looked flat, especially on the center surface here, that's where I do most of the riding, then I would look at replacing it at that point. If you get more of like a road slick tire, there's not much tread to erase anyway. Those tires may not last as long to begin with. But in that case, I would also look for a couple of other things. You can see sometimes cracking in the sidewall of the tire. I can't show you it on this because there isn't really any happening on this, but that usually happens with age and weathering. And I have had one tire when I was an undergrad where I had ridden on it for so long without replacing it that I eventually pumped it up to fill it up. And then I got this big bubble kind of coming out from the side and the top of the tire. This big kind of, it was like my tire was a snake and it had eaten a mouse or something like that. I'm not exaggerating, it's huge. Don't ride that kind of thing. Deflate your tire, replace your, or deflate your tube and replace your tire in that case. What I would start with though is the tread and the aging and stuff like that. Because if you get to the point where you see irregular shapes coming out of your tire, you've ridden it actually too long at that point. Same with your chain. Chains stretch out over time. There is a tool called a chain checker that will allow you to assess how stretched out your chain is. Don't buy one of those unless you want to do a lot of cycling. Just take it to a shop every once in a while and have them tell you if you need to replace your chain.
Chain, or if you get your bike outside, the chain gets rusty.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
Great. Well, we went a little over time, I think in part because of the kind of experimental nature of the content and the format. Thanks to everybody who could join us, and thanks also to everybody who can stick with us as we went over a little bit. We appreciate your patience and your questions. Yeah, feel free to, like Emily said, make use of the local resources, group rides, bike shops, the bike lab, and ask questions, enjoy yourselves, be safe, get an education on how to ride safely on the streets, and we'll try to post some of the information we've presented today.
Thank you, Ben and Emily, for putting this together, and thank you all for coming, and keep your eyes open for announcements for future Adventure 101 talks, hopefully at some point back in person. Thanks again.